In the US and in Canada, some universities have even hired private security firms linked to Israel, including former IDF soldiers who recently served in Gaza, to surveil and to suppress activism on campus. So just try to imagine that, hiring those involved in the repression of Palestinians to police students on campus protesting that very repression. So the way I see the different strategies that our universities have used in evading that responsibility is, of course, first I have to mention that the situation differs across regions. Germany, the Netherlands, the US and Canada have been particularly aggressive in cracking down on student protests. But these strategies aren't new. We've seen them before. And in this piece, I lay out some of the key tactics that universities have used, not just to avoid meaningful action or inaction, but to actively obstruct movements for justice. A first technique or strategy that they've used is weaponizing so-called neutrality and academic freedom. So universities, they often claim that they can't take a stance, that they must remain neutral. But that's, of course, a lie. Academic institutions are never neutral in where they invest, who they collaborate with, or which injustices they choose to condemn. And if they were truly neutral, they would cut ties with Israeli universities and divest from corporations complicit in Israeli apartheid and ongoing colonization policies. And so the evidence is overwhelming. Israeli universities are deeply implicated, some directly developing military technology that is used in Gaza, others legitimizing colonial policies to justify ongoing occupation, ongoing colonial practices. And yet, when Russia invaded Ukraine, many universities cut ties with Russian institutions immediately, overnight. That proves that they can act when they choose to. So their selective use of neutrality and academic freedom isn't about principle. It's about shielding their own interests and complicity. A second tactic or technique that we've seen is silencing dissent through administrative repression. So while claiming to defend free speech and academic freedom, universities have actively cracked down on students and staff protesting their complicity. And this has ranged from bureaucratic hurdles, blocking event permits, threatening to cut funds, to outright repression, including disciplinary actions and expulsions of staff and students. In the US and in Canada, some universities have even hired private security firms linked to Israel, including former IDF soldiers who recently served in Gaza, to surveil and to suppress activism on campus. So just try to imagine that, hiring those involved in the repression of Palestinians to police students on campus protesting that very repression. A third strategy that we've seen unfolding is the use of so-called constructive dialogue as a deflection. And of course, debate at universities is extremely important. But what we've seen is a deliberate misuse of so-called dialogue to stall, to halt any type of meaningful action. At best, universities call for so-called balanced discussion. Many don't even allow that, without ever addressing power imbalances, ensuring in that way that critique remains trapped in an endless cycle of inconsequential debate. And real decisions in the meantime about funding, about partnerships, about investments happen behind closed doors, completely unaffected by any of these so-called dialogues or discussions. And a fourth strategy is what we could call legal acrobatics to evade accountability. So most institutions simply ignore legal obligations, while others manipulate them to justify further inaction. So they claim that cutting ties with Israeli institutions would violate collaboration agreements, for example, under in the case of Europe, the European Horizon funding programs, which also funds collaborations with Israeli institutions. But the reality is they are not only morally and ethically obligated to act, they are legally required to under international law. So the International Court of Justice, for example, has already ruled that there's a plausible evidence of genocide. This isn't just about academia. These same tactics, neutrality, repression, empty dialogue, legal loopholes, they're all used also in cultural institutions, in museums, for example, in corporations, and they all follow very similar patterns of complicity and justifications for its continuity. But universities, I think, stand out because they claim to be spaces of critical thought and ethical leadership. They present themselves as society's moral compass, as champions of enlightened democratic values, and yet their response has been a complete betrayal of the principles that they claim to uphold.